What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Rise of the Ronin, a previously PlayStation exclusive title that recently made its way to PC, which is what I'm covering. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Rise of the Ronin, no review key or anything there, probably unsurprisingly. I actually just bought the PC port of it, which is how I'm bringing you this review. And what's more, with this game being out so long, it's a pretty easy 100%, everything is out there in guide form, but what's more, the achievements themselves cover, I would say, most of the game, discounting some of the midnight difficulty, which is effectively the game's post-game. But seeing how that post-game focuses entirely on the combat and redoing missions for a bit of a gear grind that isn't otherwise related to the open world nature of the main game, I can kind of see why they didn't bother to add achievements for it, frankly. But with that out of the way, let's actually talk about the game itself. So, Rise of the Ronin released last year to, I would say, mixed reviews. Some people enjoyed it, other people not so much, and I have to say, after playing it for myself, I can definitely see why, because as with most of Team Ninja's games, the combat is a really great time. Everything else surrounding that combat is hit or miss. There are parts of it I really enjoyed, like for instance flying the glider around, bizarrely even collecting all of the cats despite their very odd animation, I guess. They look very strange. And even the game's sort of random events, which it calls, I think, chance encounters, have a way of adding some life to this open world. But once you get beyond that stuff, it really is just sort of a checklist open world with the run-of-the-mill stuff to do. Clear out outpost, find area, take pictures, the usual stuff. And doing so then increases your bond with that area, which actually just marks everything else on your map for you. So outside of the combat, I can definitely see why people wouldn't exactly get along with this title. And that's obviously made a little bit worse in the case of the PC port because of its technical state. As you are probably aware, since this is a PC channel, and I've already talked about it a little, the PC port of this game is simply not great, frankly. In fact, if you look at the reviews over on Steam for this, almost all of it comes down to how poorly the game runs. And I definitely experienced some of that myself. Over the course of a couple weeks with this title, I had numerous crashes. There are certain parts of the game where the FPS just really tanks, which makes for an experience that is not unplayable by any means. You can definitely get through it, but it's definitely the kind of thing that cuts into that experience a fair bit, which I would say obviously goes a long way for explaining the reviews themselves. So if you're gonna play this on PC, be aware of that. Now, I will say already the devs over on Steam have put out an update basically saying that we are going to be, releasing patches, that usual stuff. So they're on it, but how long that takes is obviously up for debate. But nonetheless, they are working on it. From there, let's talk difficulty. So when you fire this game up, we have difficulty options. Now, at the start of the game, you have the option between dawn, dusk, or twilight, which is basically easy, normal, or hard. After you beat the game, you unlock a special difficulty called Midnight difficulty, which makes up the game's post-game, which is as close as this game gets to a sort of proper New Game Plus. It basically allows you to run through all of the game's previous content via the Testament of the Soul, as they call it, which just lets you back up and redo missions and stuff, with that new added difficulty. Most of what is affected here is basically the stuff you would expect, health, damage, things like that, but something else I noticed is that difficulty definitely affects the parry timing, and parrying is a big part of this game. And so it gets easier to parry the lower the difficulty is, where you have to be more precise with it as the difficulty goes up. But in any event, when you get to midnight difficulty, it's more of a permission thing than anything else. You can apply it to the big open world zones, but you also have a ton more options out in the open world, so I would say it's likely to be less impactful there as opposed to the actual story missions, where you are often forced into direct confrontation with boss fights and the like. That said, what midnight difficulty, the post-game, and all of that doesn't really offer is, new content. The Testament of the Soul, which allows you to go back and redo stuff, will allow you to see all of the different variations content-wise, and you get access to that much earlier than the midnight difficulty itself. All of that to basically say, midnight difficulty is purely for people who enjoy the combat enough to continue grinding out and sort of specifying their exact gear output, because it also includes a new rarity tier of gear, and thus provides a sort of end game for people. but content-wise doesn't really do anything. Though I did want to share a kind of humorous note in that the game has one difficulty achievement, which is basically just completing a main story mission in midnight difficulty. And because of the way the game is set up with the tutorial and everything, you fight an elderly woman at the end of the tutorial who's sort of the person who raised and trained you. And so if you just finished the game and you're jumping into midnight, it makes the most logical place to start that mission, which means you kind of wind up getting the one difficulty related achievement the game has, specifically for beating up an old woman, which, while I certainly don't endorse in any way, was very funny. Moving right along though, the game does feature a character creator, but in particular we make two characters, our veiled twins, as the story revolves around us and our counterpart. Now, with that in mind, you're only going to play one of these twins primarily, which is probably something worth keeping in mind in the character creator itself. But Team Ninja has a surprisingly robust character creator. I think the one in Neo 2 especially was fantastic, and so to that end, you can actually make a wide variety of characters that look basically any which way you please. Now, in terms of actual RPG elements with consequences, that comes only at the end of character creation, and even then, it's really only going to affect the beginning of the game, which is essentially your origin. You have a choice between a few different starting setups, which give you different stats, which then affects how good you are with individual types of weapons. This is just that, a starting point. You can absolutely max out your character well before you even get to midnight difficulty, actually, in terms of skill points and their distribution and whatnot. So it isn't really necessary to min-max this choice. I would say just pick whichever one you're comfortable with and you're pretty much good to go. It's really only going to have a big effect on the first few hours. But that brings me to my thoughts on the story and the sort of general setup here. Now, with this game coming to PC very recently, just a couple weeks ago, I'm not going to go full spoilers here. I don't think it's unreasonable that people might actually be still playing through this one. So there's that. But the game itself takes place across a period of time in the 1800s of Japan. A tumultuous time in history, no doubt, but our story first picks up when our two twins here are just children, and their town, which has been rebelling against the shogunate, is pretty violently put down. But you and your twin are rescued by the Bladesmith, the sort of master of a secret organization known as the Veiled Edge. The Bladesmith then puts you through a whole bunch of training to make you a pair of Veiled Edges, two people who operate as a team taking on missions. You get sent on one such mission, which unsurprisingly goes wrong, which is in large part why we have a story, but ultimately we get taken down in a fight against an enemy aboard this ship that we were supposed to be sneaking onto, and your twin ultimately doesn't make it, though it does let you choose which one you want to keep, by the way. When we get back to our village, it's unsurprisingly being attacked as well, and we're ultimately forced to confront our mentor as we make our way to leave. Sort of a mercy killing for them, if anything else, after the failure that has happened here. And from here, we make our way out into the world as a Ronin, which is where things get a little shaky. I think the beginning of this game is good enough, but shortly after this, when we make it to the open world sections, we find ourselves caught between two different factions, the pro-shogunate and the anti-shogunate factions. And over the course of the game, you're going to be siding with one or the other, which can lead to a few variable outcomes that ultimately don't really matter too much, because the choices themselves are minimal and they tend to be very binary. And what's worse is this game often has you working for both factions at the same time, constantly sort of flip-flopping you back and forth between people who are clearly at odds with each other, and it doesn't feel great, especially because a ways into the story you get introduced to the Testament of the Soul, which is your ability to replay things later. Now the thing is, especially if they're going to give you this replay method, kind of build right into the game, I think what would have been much better is to have given you two distinct paths through this game for each faction, rather than the way it's presented here, because then you could use the Testament of the Soul at the end and, kind of just go back through the game again with that entirely alternate path that was, of course, possible then. But as it stands, I don't really like the way this is laid out because it's too wishy-washy. There's a couple of choices in there that lead to real tangible consequences, like for instance, there's people you can kill or spare, and then that, has effects on who is your allies later because they won't be there if you killed them. But you can even use the Testament of the Soul to go back and sort of take the alternate route there even. So even when it gives you choices, it also is kind of like, hey, if you want to change this at any point, here you go. And so while I enjoyed the story well enough for what it was, what I will say is I really do wish it was a game that actually committed to making you make a choice. And then if they want to introduce the Testament of the Soul at the end and allow you to see the other path, I think that would have been totally fine. But the way it's done here, I don't really love. And it's one of those areas that I think could have used some refinement, frankly. basically. From there though, let's talk progression. So unsurprisingly, with Team Ninja's history with combat-oriented titles, their progression systems are pretty on point, I would say. They're a little more laid back than some of their previous work like Neo, in the sense that some of it's kind of restrained, and no matter what you do, as long as you're progressing, you're going to be making some tangible improvements to your character, and combined with the actual difficulty settings, you should be perfectly okay here. So while the game does have some Souls-like mechanics, I would not really consider this a Souls-like title, like Souls-light at best. So that's something to know, but basically progression comes down to your level ups, your skills, your gear, combat styles, bonds, and the technology trees. First up, we level up as the game goes on, which earns you skill points. Now, the side thing here, though, is that when you defeat enemies and complete quests, you also gain karma. Karma effectively acts like experience in a Souls-like game, where if you die, you lose karma, and then you have to go fight that enemy to get it back. But it does function a little bit differently because you have a karma gauge. Every time that gauge fills up, you earn skill points. Sometimes it earns you extra skill points called rare skill points, but we'll get to that in a second. So this is a way of giving death consequence, I would say, because otherwise there isn't any, you just try again. But even here, you gain karma so easily, and you're only ever going to lose so much of it until you earn that other skill point anyway. So it's kind of whatever in my opinion, but it is there though. So that's another way to earn skill points. Now the skills themselves are divided up initially into 4 different trees: strength, dexterity, charm, and intellect. Now this is important because a lot of weapon types will be associated with different stats, as an example. So like katanas and odachis are typically associated with strength. This means as we put skills in, say, the strength tree, our strength stat goes up, which makes us better with those weapons. Now the thing is, while skill points will generally get you most of what a skill tree has to offer, it won't get you everything. That's where the rare skill points come in. You actually also, in addition to regular skill points, earn strength, dexterity, charm, and intellect points. These are used to purchase special skills within those trees that focus on those specific things. Now while this can be a little restrictive towards the beginning of the game, as I mentioned a bit earlier, the thing is, it's not permanent by any means. You absolutely can max these skill trees out, and when you do, you actually gain the ability to convert those rare skill points into regular skill points, which will then help you max out the other trees. But what's more, once you unlock Midnight difficulty in the post-game, you unlock a 5th tree called the Breakthrough skill tree, which lets you use the skill points that you earn after having maxed out your other trees on just sort of passive boosts to your character. They're going to help you out in Midnight difficulty if you're doing that. But then there's also combat styles. As we complete missions and meet people and create bonds, we'll learn various combat styles for different types of weapons. Some combat styles can be used with a variety of weapons, others are more specific, but that's important because each combat style comes in one of 3 basic types: Chi, Jin, or Ten, and those all have a sort of rock, paper, scissors effect with enemies you'll fight based on the type of weapon they are using. I mentioned that you have to meet people to get these. That's where the bond system comes in. So all of the characters you meet and ally with over the course of the game, there's like 30 plus, when you do their missions, give them gifts, etc., their bond goes up. This can reward you with gear, skill points, and upgrades to those combat styles. Those combat styles can be upgraded, which gives you access to more skills when you happen to be using them, basically more special moves that you can use. So bonds are pretty important as a result of that, but mainly for the combat styles you're wanting, and then initially some of the skill points are pretty nice as well. Now I will say I think they cast too wide a net with the bond system, in the sense that there's just too many people who don't get enough story here. I think they would have been better off going with maybe say 10 or so more deeply involved characters who then as a result have a more interesting story with some fleshed out time, but they just introduce you to so many people over and over again who each have a bond associated with them, and it can get a little hard to keep track of who's who, especially when you start looking at the faction stuff. So I don't love the way bonds were handled here, but I can see what they were going for. Now the technology tree is basically your upgrades to things like your glider, a potential flamethrower you can get, which while novel I didn't find very useful, and then an item called the detector, which will help you find things in your surroundings, which isn't terribly difficult to do anyway, so I don't think you really need it, which means the technology tree is there but a little underwhelming. Even if you don't like it though, you're going to want to upgrade it, because as you upgrade your technology tree you get access to things like extra sort of accessory slots, which will let you equip more gear, that kind of stuff. So it's useful even if you're not actually planning on using the main things you're upgrading. And then last but not least, we have the gear system. So this is effectively Team Ninja's sort of Diablo-esque gear system that's in all of their other games, but a little more reined in. And what I mean by that is that it has less affixes and less overall set bonuses than I've seen in their previous work. And I'll say this up front, I don't think this gear system makes a ton of sense in this particular game because of the open world sort of almost more action-adventure nature of it. I think they would have been better off just making up more set gear sets that you could equip instead, because it actually kind of runs into the same problem I had with Wo Long, which is where, at least when that game released, you're likely going to find a sort of set bonus that works for you pretty quick, and then you're going to keep that and you're going to look for gear with that set bonus and then just kind of upgrade to that stuff. And as a result of that, you're getting just a metric ton of gear you're never going to use, and that's fine in Team Ninja's other mission-based stuff where the combat and the loot is the point. But here, I just don't think it quite fits. Now, they do have a variety of methods of letting you customize this gear, both cosmetically. You'll get access to a place called the Longhouse, which is effectively like your little player hub where you can redesign your gear, that is to say transmog it, alongside a host of other activities. But at a blacksmith, you can also do things like a bond transfer, which allows you to transfer an affix from one piece of gear to another piece of gear with an open slot for an affix. So basically, if you can find gear with the set bonus you want, you can just then bond transfer other stuff onto it. And then late game in the midnight difficulty, you can just wholesale replace affixes as opposed to having to have an empty slot, which will effectively let you customize exactly what you're after. But again, I didn't love the gear system at play here. Now, another sort of aspect to that is the skills in terms of things I didn't enjoy that much, because the skills cast a wide net, and with this being an open world game as opposed to the mission-based stuff previously, some of the skills in this game will give you the ability to do things like, say, lie in conversations or even pickpocket people, but those feel a little bland because most of the dialogue option stuff you can get doesn't substantially affect the game in any way. Normally it just gives you a chance to, say, get extra gear or maybe a bond choice to increase the bond with another character, but thanks to gifts you can do that easily anyway. And then other skills to interact with the environment, like pickpocketing from people, increases your wanted level. But the thing is, the wanted system in this game is very weak. If you disappear for just like a few seconds, it goes away almost immediately and just doesn't really matter. So while I can see what they were going for with some of this, I do think a little bit of it is kind of on the weaker side and could use some iteration, if only because this jump to an open world from their more traditional games warranted more changes than I think were necessary here. So it's a decent first draft, but I don't think it quite fits. Which brings me to the gameplay and world side of things. So, as I've mentioned a few times, open world RPG, but the thing is, it's actually 3 different areas. Over the course of the story, you'll be making your way to 3 different big hubs that you'll explore. And then within those big hubs, we've got things like the main missions, our bond missions for the people we've met along the way, and then the actual side quests. But by and large, it is a big checklisty open world that quite literally has checklists for every area you're in. Now, if you enjoy that kind of thing, I think it's solid enough for what the game is. If you don't enjoy that kind of thing, you're probably not going to enjoy it here. But I will say it does have a few things going for it that made running around fun for me, at least. So, for starters, we've got the glider. You get access to a glider relatively early on, which obviously lets you glide places. And they actually kind of roped this into combat with some of the technology upgrades, which let you start throwing bombs while you're up there, and then you can even assassinate enemies from above this way as well, which adds some dynamic elements to it that were fun to see, frankly. You can also get onto and climb most things with a grappling hook that you have access to. This lets you climb all over buildings and then, obviously get up high to where you can then use that glider more effectively, which can let you either bypass or, say, sail straight into problems that you run into in ways that, if you set it up properly, are pretty fun, and I can see why people enjoyed messing around with that stuff. We also have things like chance encounters. This is where the game world feels the most alive because it's actually location-based. Basically, there are random encounters you can experience while exploring the game different cities and stuff, or even just out in the country, and then these will lead to unique interactions like, say, breaking up a fight, clearing out some drunks, stopping robberies, that sort of thing. So I actually did surprisingly enjoy the random encounters of this game, even if they do get a little repetitive after a while. Otherwise, though, it's pretty much what you'd expect, as I mentioned earlier. There are outposts you can go into, clear out. This restores order in the area, which then lets you, sort of access that place as both a town and fast travel point. Once you get access to a camera, you can find locations where you can take pictures of the environment and visit historical landmarks, that kind of things. There's plenty of things to actually go see, but it's not really like a systemic open world in any way. Now, with it being a checklist, though, it's actually pretty easy to mark that checklist off because each sort of individual province of each area that you're in has a bond associated with it. As you do things like restore order to public places, visit landmarks, find cats for the geisha who's asking you to do so, or even just complete quests and random encounters in that general area, you'll increase your bond. As the bond goes up to a maximum of 3, you'll both get rewards for having done so, but also it will just straight up mark everything in that area on the map for you to go find, which makes checking all of this stuff off a pretty easy thing to do. Which means the only thing there's really left to talk about here is then the factions. So the factions are something you actually see represented in the game itself, both in terms of the characters you meet and the people, occupying those areas. But there's another system here that I don't think quite comes together in any meaningful way, in that certain provinces or territories are supposed to be held by one faction or the other, and by increasing your bond with those areas, based on who you've sided with up to that point, you can then have an effect on certain territories and how strong the enemies there are. Or at least that's what the game tells you, because I gotta be honest with you, I never felt a significant impact for this pretty much at all. As long as I was the appropriate level to take something else on, that particular system seemed to largely be irrelevant. Which is another way in which I think, adding a system that forced you to actually commit to one faction or the other for separate playthroughs might have been more interesting, because then you could have done things like locked off certain territories, as an example, behind, say, a hostile or friendly nature. And when you put all that together, I would say the gameplay and, the open world specifically of this title is fine for what it is. It didn't really blow me away. I enjoyed exploring well enough, mostly because of the methods of traversal they give you over the land itself, but I also don't think any of it's really worth writing home about either. Which then brings us to combat, the game's real highlight as it stands, I would say. We can basically swap between 2 melee weapon types, 2 ranged or sub-weapons, each of those having their combat styles we can equip to them, on top of things like stealth mechanics, grappling hooks, and even involving the environment in some of this. So straight away, ranged and stealth, it is more generally useful in the open world than the main missions, or anything with a mission-based structure, which happens on occasion. But the reason for this being is that ranged and stealth are fantastic for just dropping enemies without having to fight them, which is very doable. Stronger enemies will typically only take a certain amount of health damage from these approaches, but with some upgrades and some skills, you can actually basically cause everyone in a radius around where you've assassinated someone to go into a fear mode, which leaves them open to assassinations, which means you can chain them together. And you can abuse this a bit to clear out every enemy basically really easily outside of the sort of main leader of a given area. And you may want to consider doing something like that, because typically when you run into these outposts and even the missions themselves, they have what they call formidable foes, which are like little mini bosses. Killing these mini bosses makes all of the other enemies in the area just easier to deal with. So if you do this on a main mission, it makes the last boss fight easier, which gives you a reason not to just charge through to the end of the level, though you can absolutely do that. Otherwise, though, we're going to use the means at our disposal to fight off enemies in what, as I mentioned, is a bit of a Souls-light situation. So we do have a key bar, which is effectively our stamina, and if we run out of that, we are temporarily vulnerable and obviously can't react to enemy incoming attacks, which is especially important because this game is, I would say, really heavy on the parries in particular. You can block, it's totally viable to do so. The game actually makes a point to be like, hey, sometimes you should actually just try to block. But if you want to give yourself the best opening, and if you're really good at it, you can absolutely decimate the enemies with parry mechanics. And this is because if you can successfully parry chains of attacks, enemies go into like a sort of panic state, which is a temporary reprieve where they're pretty much entirely vulnerable, and you can smash them to bits, potentially eating into their key bar. And if you both reduce the maximum and also just reduce it to 0 generally, they go into an exhausted state as well, at which point you can critical them, which is not all that dissimilar from, say, an assassination, outside of, it just not killing them outright if they're a boss enemy. As a result of that, I would say this is a game whose combat you will enjoy the most if you enjoy parry type mechanics. Guarding is a thing, it is viable, but the better you are at parrying, the better you're going to do with this game overall. Now there are a couple more mechanics though. I mentioned combat styles earlier, so we can equip up to 3 styles with a given weapon. This is important because, as I mentioned, they're all kind of divided up into subtypes, and based on the weapons that the other enemies are holding depends on one of those 3 subtypes you want to be in terms of combat style, which is going to basically show you a little up or down or, just neutral symbol next to an individual enemy's nameplate or health bar to show you how effective your combat style is against theirs, which is obviously going to prove more effective for you. But what's more, the combat styles you have equipped is actually going to determine then your martial skills. As you fill up your blood gauge, or the blood on your weapon basically, you can then perform martial skills, which are associated with the combat style you are currently in. So this is where you're going to get your sort of special attacks on top of what you're already doing. And that's kind of the bulk of the core combat system. Now, I will say that for me, I really enjoyed this. It is definitely easier than, say, their Neo titles as an example, which again is one of the reasons I would not really equate this game to a Souls-like in any way. It is substantially easier most of the time, and it is much more forgiving of mistakes, even on the higher difficulties. But nonetheless, there are some enemies who, thanks to like the timing and methods of their attacks, can be particularly challenging to deal with. Not least of which because some of these enemies just move in a way that I have a really hard time getting a beat on. And then unsurprisingly, from the makers of Neo, some of these guys deliberately try to bait you into a failed parry and then follow that up with an attack. And then other times there are enemies that you can send into a panic state who, instead of panicking like normal, actually follow up with another attack right after that you then have to watch out for. So as somebody who plays a lot of these types of games, that's not terribly mind-blowing to me, but I do think it's the kind of thing that might annoy somebody if you're not used to these types of games, because it's clear what they are doing there is trying to, of course, react to what you might initially think to do and then punish that. Which is why some of the bosses might take a few tries as you sort of learn their moveset and when exactly to parry. And then, as I mentioned, there are some enemies I just never really got the hang of. But luckily for you, and another one of the reasons this game is much easier than normal, is that you are going to have allies in pretty much every major mission. There are very few bosses that have to actually be fought solo. This is because for the main missions, you can take on those people that you've formed bonds with or vows of comradeship, and through increasing their bond and later through the breakthrough skill tree, you can make them even stronger as well to help you out, and in some cases they can distract the enemy or have their own abilities, and you can even swap to them in combat if you want. And altogether, I would say that makes the combat very approachable for pretty much everybody, while still having a really high skill ceiling if you want to get really into it. Which is why I think it's the highlight of this game overall. But that does finally bring us to the Steam Deck section. So officially, this game is unsupported on the Steam Deck, and after having played it for myself on the Steam Deck, I can say that I would largely see where they're coming from. I, obviously do want to emphasize that you absolutely can play this on the Steam Deck. It's just probably not going to run very well. Especially it's going to get a very low FPS, and in an action game like this, just isn't going to probably be acceptable for most people. So technically speaking, can you get it up and running? Yes. Is it an enjoyable experience on that particular bit of hardware? No, I don't really think so. And that brings us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, for me, definitely the combat, obviously, alongside some of the means of traversal and exploration that went into that. Things like gliding and then using that glider to then sort of supplement your own combat. And how stuff like that plays into exploration was a good bit of fun for me personally. I also think some of the bond missions, that is to say the relationship you have with some of these people that you meet along the way, is pretty good, and I do wish they had doubled down more on those in, a sort of smaller but deeper situation, rather than this wider and less impactful situation they have with most of these people. But there are a few select ones that are clearly closer to the story that I actually think they did a good job of sort of developing those relationships with and showcasing those characters as a bit of a side note. But on the negative side of things, first and foremost, the performance of the PC port is not great. Obviously not a way you want to actually launch a game here, but I also think things like the gear system don't really fit this particular genre shift that they did. I also think things like choice and consequence could have been handled very differently, and as a result of that, have been more impactful rather than this sort of wishy-washy trying to play everybody's sides thing that they do here in a way that just narratively doesn't make any sense, for me at least. And then it doesn't help that alongside all that stuff, a lot of these systems feel like the first draft of something that could be good, which brings me to my conclusion. I will say that Rise of the Ronin feels like a whole bunch of systems that make up pieces of a puzzle that just doesn't quite fit together. Which doesn't surprise me, as Team Ninja is not really known for their open world adventures. They've tried to adapt some of the systems they've used in their previous games to this experience, and in some places I think it works, in other places not so much. And it's no surprise to me then that this game got the mixed reviews that it got. Which is why, for me, I would say this game is a buy on sale. It's $50 US over on Steam, and having paid that $50 US, I gotta tell you, I don't love it for that price. I think I would have preferred to pay like $30 for this, because while the combat is a lot of fun, it just doesn't quite make up for how weak it is in other places. With that in mind though, I actually really hope that Team Ninja does not give up on this formula. I really do think that if they iterated on some of these ideas and fleshed them out a little bit more, they would really be onto something and could make that even more fun. Like, obviously adding choice and consequence to the narrative, having deeper relationships through fewer bonds and everything, even potentially adding some more mechanics to the way the actual open world system works, and basically just make some of these systems feel more impactful than they are, then I think they could actually iterate on this formula and make something really great. But for right now, for this game, I'd say it's definitely a buy on sale for me, which is as good a place as any to wrap up this particular video. And so, if you enjoyed all of that, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, stick around, let me know how you feel about this one down in the comments section below, as I'm obviously quite a ways past its original release date back on PS5, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.